Dave Broker, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Hi, thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have a chance to talk. You host your own podcast, so you have these types of discussions often, and it's fun to connect with people who are having these types of dialogues on a regular basis. As we get started, I just want to share Dave's brief bio with the listeners. Dave Broker is the host of the Industrial Revolutions podcast, the story about how a primate species called Homo sapiens built into interconnected world of skyscrapers, robots, airplanes, vaccines, and nuclear bombs. Each month, he releases new episodes about the history of the last 250 years and the impact that new technologies have had on the world's economies, governments, religions, families, environments, and more. And today, we're going to be talking about some of those shifts and how those have impacted the world, and kind of our framing of human capital, and try to have a better sense for understanding how we find ourselves in the situation we are in today, and what that means not only for organizations but for broader society. So this is a little different than the typical type of interview that I do on the podcast and the type of discussion I have, but it's a super interesting opportunity, and I'm excited to talk with you. Anything you would like to share about background or anything personal that you'd like to share before we get started?
Well, I'll say this. One of the reasons I started the podcast was because, we are seeing just a massive amount of transformation on the horizon in terms of us as employees, as far as us as, members of our own families and so forth. And so I wanted to explore what has happened in these last 250 years because it gives us some guidance, this history, in terms of what's coming next. How we can even to some extent predict our own reactions to what's coming next based on what's happened before. So that was really the motivation for the Industrial Revolutions.
Yeah, excellent. And I should share, this is not something I think I've shared much with my listeners previously. I'm a professor of organizational leadership. I teach organizational development and change management, organizational leadership, HR type of courses. My PhD is actually in sociology, where I did comparative international sociology, international political economy, and work in organizations. And so a lot of that is actually related directly to what you're talking about. So going back in time and looking at the shifts in the nature of work over many centuries, and global shifts in power, and kind of these macro processes that are shaping the nature of work, and the nature and the experience of employees across the world. And so that's a lot of what I did in my training, a lot of what I have done in my research. And nowadays, when I focus on my research, I'm really focused more in like the last 50 years and how that informs what's happening, moving forward into the future of work. But taking an even broader lens and trying to understand all of these drivers and how they've been impacting things over hundreds of years is really, I think, important and enlightening, to try to help us make sense of where we're at right now. So anyways, we're two peas in a pod, I think, when it comes to our interests in these issues.
Yeah, well, even more than last few years, human society, how we organized ourselves as humans for social cooperation, it was relatively unchanged for about 10,000 years, right? And some people got to be kings or bishops or lords or whatever. Well, most people were craftsmen or peasants or slaves, and all of that has changed in just these last 250 years. I pointed out on Twitter a while back that 250 years ago, over 90% of the world's countries were ruled by monarchs, and now it's I think less than 10%. So that's the kind of transformation we've seen, and that's pretty extraordinary, and it's because of industrialization in a very large part.
Yeah. So, and let's start there. I mean, it's the name of your podcast. You've just been referring to it. This
Mhm.
tremendous shift that's just happened in relatively recent history over the last couple hundred years, and we can mark at least a big part of that shift coming from because of the Industrial Revolution. So, what do you mean by that when you talk about the Industrial Revolution? Why did you choose that as the name for your podcast?
Sure. Well, the Industrial Revolution is a period that different historians will define in different ways. There's a very good argument to be made that we're still in the Industrial Revolution. There's still this transformation underway. It's not like the pace of technological change, for example, has started to taper. If anything, it is only grown exponentially. It's only accelerated. But many do talk about there maybe being 3 or even 4 industrial revolutions. We hear this all the time when people talk about Industry 4.0, for example. And so I don't necessarily agree with that, but it is very convenient for how I structure the podcast. So, in terms of breaking things into historical chunks. Right now, I'm still on the first industrial revolution. I'm actually going to be wrapping that up in September. And for my purposes, I date that between roughly 1760 and 1848. So,
Yeah,
um,
thank you. Oh, go ahead.
and I'll say, like this is a period where, we don't see things quite like electric lighting yet, but we see the invention of the steam engine, which is the first source of power that's not by wind or water or muscle. You've got advanced techniques appearing in things like iron making and mining and farming. And farming is one that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it should. You also see the development of precision engineering at this time, which was very overlooked for a very long time, and it's only now starting to um, appear in the focus of historians. And then you've got all this improved transport infrastructure, first with canals and then with railroads. And of course, then you've got the introduction of the factories, which is a big one for the purposes of exploring human resources and human capital.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, obviously, I think most people, when they think about the Industrial Revolution, they think of factories.
Mhm.
And that just fundamentally shifted the way work was done for people who were in these urban centers and working in factories. But you highlighted other other technological advances that also vastly changed the landscape. So perhaps we can focus there for a minute. So, for example, with agriculture, now we had huge advances, or now we have the steam engine. So we have easier transportation. So we have more
Mhm.
connectedness across urban centers and across the country in the
Yeah,
U.S., for example.
it literally changed the landscape because you
Yeah.
started to have suburbs appear when you started to see the railroads get built.
Yeah, so even setting aside factories for a moment, how did this transition and these technological advances, how did it start to shift and transition the nature of human capital and the nature of work?
Well, first and foremost, it increased the population considerably. I mean, you have increased food production, you get more people. Um, on top of that, you've got greater economic productivity developing for all sorts of reasons, and factories are a big part of that. But also, if you're able to ship your goods to market faster with canals or with locomotive-driven trains, then it's speeding up the pace of transactions. It's speeding up the pace of income generation, and ultimately that reinforces itself, because you do see the evolution of capitalism in this era from being pretty much concentrated in high finance and in terms of like banks, and you see it start to develop in the accumulation of real capital, and also things like machines and whatnot, in terms of what people are owning, and as that grows, it increases material well-being, and it does spread to everyone, not equally, but it does spread to everyone to some extent.
Yeah, and so now shifting to factories a little bit. I mean, prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to factories, I mean, the vast majority of workers worked on a farm or they worked in a trade as a craftsperson. You had some merchants, you had some people in banks and finance and such. You had government workers and such. And so all of a sudden you had this huge, tremendous shift in the structure of economies, in the type of work that people were doing. You think of craft work that was done before factories, and you would have someone who was a skilled craftsman who would see a project through from beginning to end. They would do it in completion largely, and now all of a sudden they find themselves in a factory where it's assembly line, and they're doing one tiny little sliver of this entire work that's being done to produce a product. And that just caused all sorts of changes in terms of the quality of life as it relates to work. And when I think about today, like if I'm talking with leaders about how to create meaningful work, how to motivate people at work, we talk about a whole range of extrinsic motivators. We talk about a range of intrinsic motivators. And in the early Industrial Revolution, there wasn't much thought to any of that. There were people flooding the urban centers, and so there was a surplus of labor. All the extrinsic motivators were pretty low. It was more survival largely. People just needing to get a job and taking any wage they could get so they could provide food for their family. And then it's all, you think of Maslow's hierarchy, as simplistic as that is, you have to meet those basic levels before you can even start to think about self-actualization and higher levels of motivation. And so any of the intrinsic stuff didn't even really come into play. And so when you think about like Fordism and Henry Ford and the assembly line, and you think about all of that transition that happened in the nature of work, you went from very meaningful work where people could see the product, that they built this thing with their hands, and now it's so segmented and they're just doing the same repetitive thing over and over again. It dramatically shifted that, and that had implications for mental health and overall well-being and all those sorts of things. Other thoughts and insights you have about that transition?
Well, you're totally right. When people started migrating from the countryside into the cities, there's this thought that we have that the pay was so bad and people were miserable, but really, I mean, they were getting much better job opportunities in the cities than they ever had in the country, and they were actually quite grateful a lot of the time for the opportunities they were getting, because most people were farm laborers and not the skilled trades, craftspeople who worked in the medieval guilds. But at the same time, as a result of this, you do see a lack of autonomy, a lack of freedom in the workplace. Just for example, you used to own your own tools and you could pick the days you worked. But once you start getting a job in a factory, you don't get to make those decisions for yourself anymore. The boss is going to say when you need to show up and what task you need to do. And the guy who I think exemplifies this best is a guy I don't think that most Americans know about. His name was Josiah Wedgwood. And if you're British, you might know who he was. But he was born in England in 1730. He grew up as a pottery apprentice, but then he got smallpox as a teenager, and it was so severe that he needed to have his leg amputated. And the thing was that the potter's wheels of this time required you to use a foot pedal, so obviously he needed to make some changes. He first made sure to made sure to focus on his finishing skills. So, for example, putting handles on teacups, and this was a time when it wasn't taken for granted that teacups should have handles on them. He made it that way, and that's how he made a name for himself. That's how he built a business. And when he was in business for himself, he needed to get creative with production techniques. And he was a very creative guy in general, right? I mean, like centuries ahead of his time in terms of marketing and analytics. He introduced steam engines to the process. Some of the first, in fact, that were built by James Watt went into Wedgwood's factory to spin these powder wheels, which wasn't only a form of automation. It was it allowed a more consistent finish in the finished goods, and set it up on a canal so he could ship raw materials in and finish goods out faster. And all of this, by the way, is in the 1760s and 70s and 80s, which is, decades ahead of these other industrialists. But I think the thing he did that was most critical and most innovative, although I don't necessarily use that in a positive way, is what he did in terms of employee management. He came up through the guild system, but he didn't have any use for it himself. The guild wasn't going to enforce the standards of quality. He was going to enforce the standards of quality. And I mean, he would do things like pick up half-finished work and smash it and shout, "This will not do for Josiah Wedgwood," at the poor employee. But with his meticulous record keeping, he was able to analyze production to identify bottlenecks, maximize efficiencies. He could figure out how much time each step of the process would need and how much labor each step would require. And so that way he was able to divide up his machines and his employees for optimal productivity. But you're right, the workers were kept out of this process. They were intentionally not taught each step of the process, and that stemmed from his concern about intellectual property. This was a time in which patent law was just not enforced. So he was afraid that if my employee knows the trade secrets, he's going to sell them off to a competitor. So he didn't teach them that. But the effect that this had was that it de-skilled the labor. This is a term historical economists or economic historians, whatever, call it. It's the de-skilling of labor. They didn't need to be trained to be proficient potters like the guild members of the past. They just needed to learn, to do one repetitive task over and over for hours and days and years on end. And he even laid out his factory. It was called the Truria. He laid it out so that each room had a unique purpose, and there was no reason for an employee to be in a room that he wasn't assigned to. So this reinforced the de-skilling of his own workforce. And now that his workers are unskilled, they can't own the machines, right? Because they're connected to giant steam engines. They can't take them home with them. So he starts doing something else that's really new and innovative. He starts requiring employees to clock in, and he pays them an hourly wage then. This is something that just wasn't really done before. So these are some examples of things he did that were later adopted by other entrepreneurs in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I love the example, and I wasn't familiar with the story, and so that was really fun to hear you talk about that, and I appreciate it. Let's in the time we have remaining, let's start to look forward now. So we have all this track record of these shifts over the last several hundred years, the Industrial Revolution. You mentioned Industry 4.0, and we continue to have disruptive technologies, and so we're not done. These shifts are continuing to happen. As you look into the future, what are some of the biggest changes you foresee? Not necessarily predict. We don't have a crystal ball, but what are some of the types of things that you suspect we'll see, say, in the next decade?
Well, there's always the concerns people have about AI, right? I think that's a good example. One thing looking at history to give a sort of comparison, in the process of mechanizing and industrializing the textile industry in Britain in the first industrial revolution, you had this issue where, you used to have these guild members who spun wool. That was actually like one of the first guilds in Britain, was the wool spinners. And this way the government was able to say, okay, well, you can't spin this wool in the city unless, you're a guild member. Okay. So what a lot of merchants started doing was they hired independent contractors out in the country. And these were the examples of cottage industry, where they'd send them a bunch of wool, they'd let them rent a wheel, and they would spin the wool into yarn. And then somebody else would take another machine in the cottage, and they would maybe weave it into a piece of cloth. And the thing is that this is a very simple task to do. So a lot of people tried doing it, right? And then what happened next is it got mechanized. And so all of a sudden you've got all these people in the labor market doing this who are just, getting crushed in terms of opportunities. And I see the same thing happening right now with what used to be called taxi drivers, right? If you were a taxi driver, you would buy a medallion, and it was very similar to buying an apprenticeship, right? You had to pay for your apprenticeship to become a guild member. And they'd buy this medallion so that they could legally drive a taxi cab, because it was a very regulated market, just like the guilds were very regulated. And it gave them some good economic security. Well, then Lyft and Uber come along, and they say, we're going to instead build this network of independent contractors who do this without that medallion system. And over the course of 5 years or so, we saw people just flood into this opportunity, where at first, they were doing so well for themselves that they could buy like a new car to drive people around in. And by 2019, that wasn't the case anymore. The take-home income from doing that was so low, it was basically, you were just basically making ends meet. And then now we see what on the horizon: the driverless car. They're taking the need for labor out of the equation, at least in that sense. So as you saw people, build these giant spinning mules, they call them, in the factories to spin cotton, they were able to have one person do the job that used to require thousands of people working at the same time. So yeah, this is another thing we see in terms of, I think certainly the driverless car, but all sorts of technologies still have the potential to replace people. There's a few computer programs in California, one's at Stanford, one's at UC Santa Cruz. I think it's the one at Stanford, can compose like 5 symphonies a day, whereas like a composer would take months to do that. And they're just as good as what a composer could have put together, just as good as what Bach or Beethoven could have put together. The other one can write haikus, which are very easy to write, and people reading these haikus can't tell the difference between a human haiku and a computer haiku. So even the arts are up for grabs by mechanization, which is both scary and kind of humorous, I think. But just unlimited examples.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for those insights. And yeah, when we talk about the future of work, machine learning, AI gets a lot of attention. Driverless cars gets a lot of attention. Talking about mechanization and any kind of routinized tasks, it's predicted that basically almost all of those are going to be replaced in the near future by technology in one form or another. And so it's super interesting to consider those implications for shifting entire industries, disrupting jobs, displacing workers, but also creating new jobs, creating new types of work. And we are more and more into a knowledge worker environment and economy, where if people want to be marketable, They can't be doing routinized tasks. They have to be creative thinkers. They have to, be able to communicate effectively. They need all the soft skills. They need to be able to demonstrate their creativity and innovate. Those are the types of things that, at least for now, are harder, to imitate by machines. You mentioned
Exactly.
you mentioned like Uber and Lyft, and some of these other types of, other companies that have taken similar types of models in different areas. We've seen a huge shift over the last decade, really even over the last 2 decades, towards more and more gig work, more contingent workforce, a move away from the more traditional kind of 8 to 5 full-time employee type arrangement within organizations. And so it'll be super interesting to see if we continue to see that shift as well, towards more project-based work, as opposed to having people who are employees. But we see, even with like Uber, the big pushback for Uber drivers to be considered employees rather than independent contractors. So
Right.
I mean, a lot of this is going to end up playing out through shifts in legislation and in the courts as well, in terms of what it looks like to do this type of work, and does that mean we're formally associated with the organization as an employee or whatever.
Well, and I think with COVID-19, a lot of bosses are inevitably going to look at this and say, okay, our red brick factory just doesn't make sense in the 21st century. You don't need employees who are coming in to work on a computer to do that in the office. It's not necessarily a bad idea all the time, especially if you're going to have meetings and so forth, but it's not necessary on a day-to-day basis. You can get away from what Josiah Wedgwood had put together. You can get away from, the 9 to 5 routine, the clocking in. You can have a reskilling of labor, as I would call it. And, but ultimately it's not going to be the skills that, the people had in the Middle Ages, making shoes and stuff. It's going to be, like you said, soft skills. It's going to be critical thinking skills, and so forth.
Excellent. Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. We're about out of time, though I'm sure we could go on and on and on. But hopefully this has given listeners a chance to just consider a little bit of the history and how that's influencing our present day, and trajectories that might lead into the future for how we could see shifts come in the decades to come. Before we part, though, I want to give you a minute, Dave, to share with listeners how can they get connected with your podcast and any of the other work that you're doing.
Sure. So whatever podcast service you use, you can search for The Industrial Revolutions, plural, and you'll be able to find it. It's also it's at IndrevPod for all the social media platforms, and industrialrevolutionspod.com for the website. And you can check that out. Hit subscribe so you always get new episodes, just like with HCI. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It's been a fun discussion. I hope that the listeners will reach out to Dave, get connected with his podcast. Lots of more interesting insights in historical context and understanding to be had there for sure. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and the rest of their week. Stay healthy and safe, and I hope you are happy and have a meaningful experience at work.